Okay, we are here and we are live. We got
That
Patrick
showing
starting
up?
the screen share. Very good. Looks good. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the latest Aptiv webinar. Today we're going to be discussing pricing strategies specifically for subscription mobile applications, and we've got a very special guest, Patrick Falzon from the App Shop. Thanks, Patrick, for joining us. And let's get started and jump into talking about some pricing strategies, how to get your app priced just right.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So to start things off, we'll start with a little bit about me, and then I'll give a kind of high-level agenda of what we're going to cover, and we'll get into the specifics on the other side of that. But a little bit about me. So my background in apps is a mix of investing and operating, been in the space for a little over a decade at this point. Um, What that means is I've both evaluated hundreds of apps from an investing perspective, probably thousands is the more accurate figure there. And then I've also run large app portfolios as the kind of general manager, CEO of those portfolios too. It means I have a pretty broad perspective on what's worked and what hasn't worked for developers. So a lot of what we're going to get into here is kind of focusing on general rules that span categories. The thing to keep in mind, though, is depending on what category you play in or depending on what your product does, there may be product or app specific things that you should also consider on top of this. This is meant to be kind of the tried and true rules across categories. So with that, first, we'll do a refresh on why subscriptions, I mean, why subscriptions are a good business model. Then we'll get into what are some tactics you can implement to maximize your lifetime value of your subscribers. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with some benchmarks, just so you can compare, how is your performance stacking up against what it should be, and where maybe are there opportunities for improvement, or optimization in your business relative to those benchmarks. We're going to start with why subscriptions. And just as a little context here, the reason I do this is I think it's helpful to ground yourself in why you chose subscriptions as a business model in the first place as you think about pricing and packaging, and different growth tests or optimizations you can run. And really, why I say that is I find sometimes teams can get a little lost in growth hacking and lose that North Star a little bit. And it's important to kind of keep bringing yourself back and make sure what you're doing and what you're trying is aligned with the value of subscriptions, both for you and your users. So with that, in my perspective, at least, the reason why subscriptions are great is one, it's a high ARPU business model in the consumer space. It's predictable, recurring revenue, and it really closely aligns your incentives as the app developer with your users. So going into each of those in a bit more detail, based on the data we've seen, on average, subscription apps generate about 70% more revenue per user than apps that rely on advertising as their primary monetization stream. So that's a pretty significant increase. Like we said, much higher revenue per user if you're doing a subscription model. Additionally, subscription models, particularly if you're an independent app developer, thinking about turning this into a entrepreneurial journey for yourself and building a business, it's a pretty low bar, or a pretty manageable bar, maybe is a better word than low bar, to get a real business on the other side of this. And the quick math I always give people is you're charging about, $50, $60 a year for your subscriptions. At 20,000 subscribers, that's $1 million in revenue. And that's a real business at that point. And 20,000 subscribers isn't crazy relative to the amount of installs, which is hundreds of millions that happen in the App Store every day. So that's kind of the big appeal here is the high ARPU business model, and a pretty quick path to getting to a real business. Additionally, like I said, you get recurring predictable revenue. So what we've seen from apps we've worked with is at scale. So meaning you're generating a couple $1 million in revenue. You've been doing this for a few years, so you're starting to get those renewal cohorts. About 70% of your revenue every year can come from renewals. The reason that's awesome is the kind of very simplified example that I give people is like that means on January 1, you could close your eyes and do nothing, and 70% of your revenue is just going to appear for you. That's awesome. In an advertising model or in more like transactional models, the reality is like you're constantly going out every single month and like farming, hunting, whatever metaphor you want to do to get that money in the door. There's just something really nice about being able to have that predictability of like, I know there's a floor on what I'm going to do this year. And then combined with that is also on renewals, obviously, there's no customer acquisition cost accounted for in those renewals. Like they just come in. You don't have to go out and reacquire those users, or rarely do you have to go out and reacquire those users. So that's really attractive. And then lastly, it really closely aligns your incentives with users. Personally, this is one of my favorite aspects of the model, which is I think this is a pretty common refrain these days, but like if you're not paying for the product, you are the product in the advertising world. Um, Whereas in the subscription model, like you generate revenue and profits when you deliver value to your users and you deliver a good product that they want to pay for over an extended period of time. That is the easiest and best way to generate money in a subscription model. Um, and that simplifies a lot of things. Like you should be very aligned with your users. The things you roll out, they should like. You shouldn't have to have like the friction that sometimes comes in an advertising model where if you want to increase ad load or other ways to kind of increase your monetization can actually detract and degrade from the user experience. That's not the case in subscriptions. Everything you do should be increasing value that users are getting out of your product. And so again, these are all just things to keep in mind as you think about tactics you can be employing in your business, and make sure that you're staying aligned with these kind of themes of why you hopefully picked the subscription model in the first place. And so with that, getting into the meat of what probably everyone actually wanted to hear from this session, how do you go about figuring out how to price your app? How do you go about figuring out how to maximize the value you're getting out of those subscriptions? Start with paywall strategies. Obviously, pricing is kind of on the other side of someone actually reaching your paywall and converting on your paywall. It's a big role in that, but you should first think about actually what percent of installs are reaching your paywall in the first place. This is one of the biggest levers you're going to have in your business. So you should really focus on that metric specifically. It's also one of the reasons why we suggest always include a paywall in your onboarding. It's the quickest, easiest way to maximize the percent of installs that reach your paywall. Um, and again, kind of if you think about your funnel, installs are at the very top of your funnel of people entering your app. So you want that's kind of going to be your biggest lever play. If you could say another extra 5% of installs see a paywall, that's a very large absolute number of incremental users seeing a paywall versus something further down funnel of, 5% of users that stuck around for 7 days, is a much smaller number. So that's one. Two is constantly test your paywalls. What we've seen in the data is for developers, the average number of paywall tests per app per year is about 13. The obvious kind of other math you can do on that is that's about one paywall test a month. And I suggest to developers, like you should write that down in your objectives and just like have that be a recurring like to do for yourself is make sure every month you are running at least one paywall test. That can take a lot of shapes, forms. That can be a wholly new paywall design. That can be a pricing test. That could be just changing the call to action on the button at the bottom of your paywall from, try for free to continue or something else. It could be changing the presentation of the numbers. So it could be little, it can be big, but just make sure you are running at least one test every month. There is an element when it comes to growth testing, in my view at least, of just like volume. There have been a lot of growth tests teams I've managed have launched. And in the back of my head before they launched them, I was like, no way is this thing going to work. Like, why are we wasting our time? And then it turns out to be like a huge winner. So it's like, it's hard to always know what users are going to react to. And frankly, some of the winners don't always make like intuitive sense, at least to me. So the best way you can kind of overcome those things is just always do a high volume of constant, consistent testing. The other piece of advice I give on the testing front, specifically when it comes to paywall designs, is also think about ways that you can use different designers. And really what you're getting is different styles, but I actually find targeting different designers is the quickest way to accomplish that. This will probably change with time, with the introduction of like generative AI tooling in the space. But for the time being, I would think about how can you increase the number of designers working on paywalls for you. There are some obviously like really cheap things like going through marketplaces like a Fiverr or an Upwork, and getting designers just to churn out like, five to 10 paywalls for you for a couple $100, you could typically accomplish. The reason I suggest this is like any role, every designer is going to have some degree of a like unique personal style. And oftentimes what I find is like what you'll get then is you'll get iterations of their perceptions, like their worldview, their unique style. And sometimes like just bringing in a wholesale new designer who thinks about your product differently, who thinks different things are interesting, their brain is just wired differently, can really unlock value for you. Then I think it's also, like I said, if you use things like Upwork and Fiverr, it's also a pretty cheap thing to do. So I would recommend that as well. And then lastly, we'd say don't be afraid to think outside the box. And this will come up a couple times as we get through the webinar. But I think a trap that's easy to fall into with growth testing is continually doing iterations of the same thing. So in my prior example, when I said run tests at least once a month, I was like, you can do big or small tests. That's true, but you can't always do small tests. Every once in a while, make sure you are going back and just testing a wholesale new design that looks totally different than what's in place. Obviously, there needs to be some degree of brand consistency. Like the paywall can't be totally jarring and different from the rest of your app in terms of like the colors and the fonts and the brand personality there. But make sure you are taking a step back and testing something wholesale new. Otherwise, you're going to arrive at like a local maxima, basically meaning like you will get the most out of that specific design, but you may be missing step function improvements outside of that specific design. And then if you wrap that all up, again, based on the data we've seen, the relative growth rate of apps that do at least 10 paywall tests a year is roughly double that of apps that don't, that do under 10 paywall tests a year. There's probably some degree of selection bias in there because if you're doing a lot of tests, you're also inherently more invested in your product and working more on it. But I don't think that explains all of it. And I do think there is a very big benefit from continually testing and running a high volume of tests. So just, I think if there's one thing to take away from this slide, it's like make a note on like the 15th of every month to launch a test. And make sure that you're both flexing into like the big changes and the little changes and you're mixing it up across that spectrum. Moving on, next we have pricing strategies. So this is going to be a mix of things. We're going to cover things like introductory offers, plan duration, and also pricing. So starting with introductory offers, we have consistently found over the years, and this is like I'd say, tested over like something like 5 to 7 years at this point, free trials almost always win in terms of adding a free trial to your subscription. Not all free trials are going to convert, so there is definitely going to be breakage from free trial to paying subscribers. But what we see is your install to paying subscriber conversion is typically higher when you use a free trial. So the amount of initial conversions you'll get to opt into that free trial will actually result in more subscribers, even if not all of them convert. And on average, what we see is if you look at kind of the install level, you'll get about a 15% higher lifetime value if you put a free trial from those incremental conversions. So if you're not using free trials, I would definitely test them. Second, what we find in terms of durations is having a mix of durations is very valuable. So if you look at the data, about 70% of paywalls offer either 2 or 3 plan durations, so meaning a weekly, monthly, annual, quarterly, monthly, annual, something like that. I think offering single durations can work, but you have to know that like you're not doing the standard approach. And the standard approach is the standard approach for a reason because it typically wins. Because a lot of times you're just going to have some users who don't want to make the long-term commitment, or vice versa, who want the discount in price by paying for a longer-term subscription. And so, like by offering only one plan, you're inherently not catering to one of those user sets. So would strongly recommend having at least 2 durations. We actually typically find only 2 is best. Rarely have I seen a situation where a developer is offered 3 subscriptions and all 3 have gotten uptake. Basically, anytime I've ever seen a paywall with 3 plans on it, one of them no one adopts, and it's just there as like a price anchor to drive people to one of the other 2 plans. So think about what 2 options you want. From our experience, monthly and annual is the most frequent winning pair. With monthly being your short-term duration, annual obviously being your long-term duration. And then within that, we also advise anchor users on the longer-term duration. So like you're going to have to pick a primary SKU, basically like what's highlighted when they land on the paywall, very tactically speaking. We always recommend by default drop them onto your longer duration plan. It's almost always going to be your higher lifetime value plan because you're getting more cash up front and you're locking them into a longer term commitment. So default them to the longer plan, but then have that shorter term option if they want to push to it. Since we're on the topic of plan durations, the other thing I'd mention here, and this comes back to that opening section of like why subscriptions and why that should be an anchor for you all. Weekly plans have gotten a lot more popular in, I'd say, the past like 1 to 2 years, especially. They certainly have value, and I think they have a place in the kind of the monetization landscape. That said, I would be very thoughtful about how and why you employ those. And really, the basic logic behind that is What I've seen, the average lifetime of a weekly subscriber is about a month. So if I go back to the like reasons why subscriptions should be good, that's probably still maximizing ARPU. I think that's probably why most people do weeklies is they run growth tests and they see they get a lot of cash quickly from weeklies because they can charge, what they probably were charging for a monthly for a weekly. So you're still getting that one, but you're not really getting recurring predictable revenue because every month you got to go out and get a new batch of weekly subscribers because the prior month's cohort has churned off completely. And you're not really aligning your incentives with your users. If they're only sticking around for a month, it's hard for me to argue that like you're building that long-term relationship and you're giving them a product they want to use over the long term. And I think inherently, if you were giving a product they wanted to use over the long term, why would they be paying a weekly price for it? Like, there's just nothing else in your life you pay weekly prices for that you use for an extended period of time. So I think, with all that said, like there are certain products and certain use cases where it's by definition a short-term use case, and a weekly plan may make sense for you. But be really thoughtful about it and like be honest with yourself about, are you just pulling a bunch of cash forward and trying to maximize cash in the door right now, which maybe that's what makes sense for you. Or is it actually what makes sense within the scope of your product strategy? And again, we would recommend do monthly and annual. And then lastly, when it comes to price, the main thing, my main advice here is just test a lot and test a lot of different options. I think the biggest mistake I find when I talk to developers is they focus a lot on competitors' pricing. So the process goes something like, we're going to go download 10 competitive apps. We're going to write down what they're charging for their price. And then we're going to look at kind of what's the average across those. And that's what we're going to price our product at. I think that's actually probably a fine way to think about, like, if you're launching a net new app, what should your starting price be? That's like a pretty reasonable way to go about benchmarking, like what should be the first thing I launch with, but then very quickly test upper, higher, lower prices. And the reason I say that is this is a personal belief. This is not supported by data, hence the asterisk on the page. I do not believe that consumers price shop and like price comparison in apps. Um, the way I describe this is like, if you just think practically speaking about what that entails, it means a person came into the app store, they're going to download like 5 to 10 different apps, go through 5 to 10 different onboarding flows. They're going to do the exercise of writing all those prices down because they can't have them all open at once. And then they're going to go into that spreadsheet and decide, okay, well, now I'm going to download app C and start that free trial because I like the pricing on it. Like, I just don't buy that. I think the competitive selection happens at install for the most part, for like 80% plus of users is my guess. And then they're going to decide once they get into your funnel, are they going to subscribe or not. And so like you shouldn't get too anchored on your competitors' pricing for that reason. So then again, what I come back to is just test a lot. Even here, we talked about like running at least one test a month. I would say within that, run at least like, I don't know, something like minimum 3 to 4 price tests a year. Just to kind of start building up those cohorts at different pricing. And one of the reasons why I think particularly early in your app's life, and it's never too late to do this though, run a bunch of price tests is typically when you run a price test, you're going to run it for, call it 1, 2 months, and then you're going to pause it. And what you'll likely have when you pause that test and you're looking to make a decision is your initial conversion data. If you're using a free trial, your free trial to paid data, and maybe like month one retention. If you have monthly subscribers or if you have weekly subscribers, the first couple of renewal points there. If you have annual subscribers, you're going to have no retention data on what that looks like. And even with monthly subscribers, you're going to have pretty limited. So you're going to do a lot of extrapolation. That's fine. And I think that's just the reality of the world we live in. But I think there's a big benefit to kind of like, if you think about like, hey, I'm just going to run like 4 different price tests over the next 6 months. You'll make a call based on that initial data, kind of when you sensitize the data, which seems best, roll it out. But then in the background, if you're using a tool like Adaptee, like those cohorts will continue to collect data. And over time, you'll get a more accurate read. So kind of like if you haven't launched price tests, launch them now, because even after you stop them, you'll continue to collect renewal data on subscribers at different price points. And like 9 months from now, that's going to be really interesting to go back and look at and understand how those different cohorts performed over time. And then moving on. So after pricing, or maybe in conjunction with pricing, I think the other thing to think about is also looking at your retention and trying to identify areas to improve your retention. the beauty of a subscription model, again, or one of the beauties of it, is the recurring nature of it. That means like you're hoping that someone's going to pay whatever you price it at multiple times. It's hard to perfectly price optimize like a very leaky bucket. So I think you should think about where is your retention relative to the benchmarks, and we'll go through those at the end of the presentation. And if there's room to improve your retention, that may be an area to focus on in conjunction with, or maybe even before you get to price testing. And I say that because if you can drive retention improvements, there's a very material compounding effect that happens in a subscription business. So what you see in the graph on this page is basically what happens if you improve retention by X%, and what happens to your LTV improvement. So if you look at this, if you're starting at a, call it 50% retention, what this graph tells you is basically for every percentage point you improve retention, you improve LTV by about double that. So at like the 25, I think say that between the 25 and 30% retention improvement line, you're looking at like almost a 50% improvement in LTV. So that's why these things are like really powerful. And the better your retention is to start, the more compounding you get from the relative improvements you drive there. So that's why I say retention is very, very important. You can get really outsized wins if you can actually make a difference on retention. And I also find that there's often a handful of like pretty low-hanging fruit tactics that apps can implement to really move the needle here. And then lastly, I'd say before we get into those tactics, the other reason why this matters is like stating what's probably very obvious to most of the people listening. The higher you price a product, the lower your conversion rate's going to be, as like a general rule. When you have really strong retention, it allows you to have high LTVs even at lower prices, and that could like make a really big difference in your business. What I sometimes see is app developers who have bad retention, and all they do is focus on their pricing testing and kind of like upper funnel testing. And what that eventually leads to is like a super high annual price or a super high weekly price is generally the two things I see, or maybe a high lifetime price. And basically what you're doing is like, because you have such low retention, what any A/B test is going to tell you is just like keep jacking up price, because all that matters is that first purchase. And so you want that first purchase to be worth as much as possible. When you have really good retention, you can be afforded the opportunity to lower your price, build a bigger subscriber base that's going to renew more times and for longer. And then you find yourself in that, going back to where we first started, having 70% of your revenue come from renewals at scale. And then you have like a really, really great business on your hands. So that's why retention is important. All that said, getting into the tactics. So first, think about your onboarding and kind of like early experience with your users. The few key tactics here are tutorials. So kind of like when they open the app, having a few screens that kind of show some demos, maybe a video or some images that are kind of a call out. So like, here's how you should use the app, or here's how to access our key features. You could accomplish similar things with tooltips too. So like doing the little like, badge on click here, and then it gives them a pop-up that explains what happens when they click there. That's a really good way to drive users to your key features. So if what you see is like, hey, person who takes X action retains twice as well as someone who doesn't take that action, you can use things like tutorials and tooltips to specifically drive users to take that action and make sure they discover it in the hopes you bring up your overall retention too. And then lastly, also consider welcome email campaigns. It's a really great way to get content in front of people. Again, just another way to highlight your key features, reassert your value proposition to them, and start building that direct communication relationship, which I think is really important. I also think it helps you just appear a bit more like professional and like legitimate as a publisher or app developer. Like you feel a bit more like a company that this person's interacting with when you're doing things like that. Then much further down in the funnel, strongly recommend implementing in-app cancellation flows for two reasons. One, I know there is a strategy out there of apps who basically make it just very hard to cancel their subscription. My philosophy on this is, at best, what you're talking about is maybe eking out like an extra payment on some percent of your users by doing that. Like if someone wants to cancel, they're going to cancel. And Apple makes it like pretty easy to cancel subscriptions as it is. So like I don't think you're really preventing a determined user in any way from canceling. All you're doing is pissing them off and ensuring that they're never going to come back and use your app again. probably driving bad reviews, which is going to negatively impact your ASO, and maybe even driving refunds, which also may negatively impact your ASO and standing with Apple. So like you're just making a bad situation worse, and I don't think you're really actually getting that much value out of doing it. Alternatively, the other scenario here is allow them to cancel easily in the app. Um, that does a couple things. One, it lets you know when they're actually canceling. Obviously, you'll get like the cancellation event from the subscription. But this allows you to actually talk to the user in that moment when they're making the cancellation decision. And then you can do things like give them a survey to figure out why they're canceling. That one will help you understand what to improve about your product because you'll understand why people are leaving it. And then two, it can also help you um, craft win back offers to them. So if someone comes in and says, I'm canceling because it's too expensive, pretty obvious thing to do would be offer them a discount and see if that makes them want to stay around. Or if they say, I'm canceling because I don't have this feature, well, put that feature on your roadmap. And when you build it 6 months later, send them an email saying, hey, we have that feature now. Do you want to come back and try us again? So it unlocks those things where if you're making it hard, you're actually losing the data as to why people are churning. And therefore, you're losing your ability to actually do something about it and improve your retention. And then lastly, going kind of a bit back to the welcome email campaign, establish direct lines of communications with your users. Suggest creating at least an optional account creation flow or email collection flow so that you can collect their emails. That allows you to do things like the welcome email campaigns. You can also send them periodic product updates on new features you're releasing. You can send them links to user surveys that you ask them to fill out, requesting features, providing feedback on your product. Just the other day we were working with someone, we want to launch user testimonials and actually like real user testimonials for a marketing campaign. They had an email list and we were able to send out a link in the email list using a tool to be like, hey, we'd love if you record a video saying why you love this product. And we're like actually getting replies back of like users doing truly UGC content talking about the product. And I think in a world of like uh, abundant AI content, AI content, that's actually a really interesting way to stand out. All of these things are unlocked by having a direct line of communication with your user. So, like, strongly suggest if you don't have that now, think about ways that you can unlock that. Few other tips. These are kind of in a sorted hodgepodge of tips. One, I think it has like a little bit of a bad reputation, is my sense, but I consider a hard paywall in your product. I think the big thing here is you should think about two things. One is if you currently have a free experience and a paid experience, like, is there actually a meaningful difference between those two things? It doesn't make sense to have both. A lot of times, I find either one of two things. One is like the free experience is just like terrible because you've extracted everything out of it to put it behind the paywall. And then like, what's really the point of someone having the free product? Like you're just giving them kind of a broken, crappy product. That's not really doing you any favors in terms of like building your credibility, increasing their likeliness to convert. Like, so you should really think about like, does the free product provide value and is it even like worth putting out into the world? One. Two, the other thing I see is you give too much away in the free product, and there's just like not really meaningful differentiation between what people are paying for, and you're kind of just counting on them like seeing a paywall and converting and not thinking too much around like what incremental value am I getting out of this. In either of those scenarios, you may be better off just having one product and it's a paid product. It's free to download, but you have to pay to actually use it. So I think hard paywalls can actually work quite well for a large number of products. We've used them in a significant percent of our products historically too. Second, this gets back to something I was saying earlier. Be wary of local maxima when you're running A/B tests. And what I mean by that is this goes back to the like just continuing iterating down the same path versus taking a step back and like rethinking holistically. One example I give here, and this was a product I used to work with, we kind of came in to consult on their pricing, and their pricing was something like $9.99 a month and like $19.99 a year. We're like, that's interesting. Like, how do you end up there? And their answer was, well, we ran a series of like 10 A/B tests, and this was the resulting winner at the end of that series of A/B tests. But like, if you take a step back and think about it, like it's kind of weird for a product to be priced at $10 a month and $20 a year. Like that's just a very weird discrepancy. And like I'm sure the A/B test told them that that was the right thing because they just kept driving more people to the annual plan, and it was technically more expensive than the monthly plan. But that's just like not a I don't know, normal thing you'd expect from a product. It makes kind of like delegitimizes you as a product. And it's hard to imagine that's actually the best pricing for your product. And so what happened was when we just said, okay, let's blank slate it and run a couple new pricing pairs that are more kind of, I'd say, be a little more traditional, to be fair. We like blew the LTV out of the water on this product. And it was just because like their series of A/B tests kept being like, okay, well, we have a monthly and annual price. Let's change one of them and see what happens. And then they get a new winner and they change a different one or change another one up and down. And then they kept going down this kind of just like this one single path and kind of forgot that there was like 50 or 100 other paths on either side of that they could be on. And so like that's what I mean by local maxima is make sure like once every quarter or once every 6 months, you're taking a step back, looking across your product, and just being like, if I was brand new to this, what would I test? Or what would I think maybe is weird? What would I think would have room for improvement? And just try some like big picture, totally new, totally different tests. Then lastly, it's specific for price testing. Sensitize retention before calling a winner. So like I said before, oftentimes when you're going to be making a call on a price test of which pairing to roll out, you're going to have very limited retention data if you're using anything other than weekly subscriptions. So what's important to do, in my view, is look at what the data is currently telling you is a winner, and then say, okay, well, if for the test group, retention comes in 5% worse than expected, or 10% worse than expected, or 15% worse than expected, is the result still the same thing? And would I still feel good about rolling that out as the winning option? And figure out like where that breakpoint is. And then think about if you feel reasonable about it. Like if your answer is retention has to be 50% worse on this test cohort for it not to be a winner, you should feel very confident rolling it out. It's hard to imagine unless you just increase price like 100x that retention is going to be 50% worse. If retention's 2% worse, you no longer have a winning price pair, you may want to press pause and like give it some more time to collect data, or you may just want to test something different because they're basically the same at that point. So that's how I would think about retention is it's just not practical to wait for retention data in a lot of cases. So use sensitivity analyses in lieu of that. And then lastly, to wrap everything up before we go to Q&A, just some quick benchmarks. Are your metrics good? And the reason this has kind of become a little bit of a thing we do when we do talks and meet with clients is for folks like Adapty, like they put out great reports on the industry that are incredibly valuable. But the thing to keep in mind when you look at these reports is it's a wide spectrum of apps. You have hobbyists in there. You have apps that aren't currently being actively worked on, but are technically using the SDK. And then you also have professional apps, and you even have like big corporate apps on these things. All of those products are going to perform very differently, and you're getting the blended average across all of them. So what this is meant to do is say, if this is your profession, either you're doing this in an entrepreneurial sense, or you're doing this for your job, and you work for a company like a big company who does mobile as its business, our benchmarks are what we think you should be holding yourself accountable to. So starting with install to free trial, most of the reports will tell you the average is kind of like mid-single digits, somewhere between 3 and 7%. We think you should probably be striving for 15% plus on that metric. Definitely 10% plus. If you're in the single digits, there is, I would say, unequivocally room for upside on your install to trial conversion. For trial to paid conversion, my experience, again, kind of from more on the investing side of being able to look across a lot of different categories, trial to paid conversion is one of the most variable metrics by category. It is very different depending on what type of app you have. So keep that in mind. This is simplifying that component of it a little bit. Industry benchmarks will tell you it's about 25 to 30% on average. From what I see, I think you should try to hold yourself accountable to 40 to 60%. Some categories won't be able to get there, to be perfectly honest. But that's kind of the closest thing to a reasonable benchmark we can come up with, which is for most categories, you should be able to get to at least 40%. And also as a benchmark, I have seen products that do like 75, 80% trial to paid retention. So it is possible to get that quite high. And then so if you basically multiply those two things together, what a lot of reports will tell you is the average is something like 2 to 4% of installs should convert to paid subscribers. We think it should be more like 6 to 10% of your installs should convert to paying subscribers. And again, this is all if you're doing this professionally. Moving on to retention. And this will come back to like how should you know if you should invest in that low hanging fruit and tactics on retention for monthly plans. Industry benchmarks are typically like 60% renewal. Actually, I think that's quite accurate. We'd say it's more like 60 to 70%, but that's a pretty good mark to hold yourself to. Something on annual, the gap's smaller here. Most industry reports will tell you it's about like 35% year one retention on annual subscriptions. We'd say more like 40 to 50%, but not too far apart on these metrics. And with that, we'll turn it over to Q&A.
All right. Thanks so much, Patrick. That's a lot of really great insights. Um, I particularly like the part about sort of being aware of local maxima. I always find that when you make that point to be just really important because it's especially as an engineer, it can be very easy to be like too focused, right? Too deep in the weeds, and you don't realize that maybe you're maximizing something you don't even want to maximize. So
Yeah.
it's a
It's
great
also
point.
when it's like, if you're an independent developer and like
Yeah.
you're working in a small team, maybe
Right.
just yourself, and this is
Yeah.
what you do all day, every day, it
Yeah.
is really easy to get buried in the weeds and
Yeah. You
like
can.
lose the
Yeah.
forest for the trees along the way.
Yeah, you can get blinders on very easily for sure. Okay, so we do have a few different questions in the Q&A section. So just as a quick shout out to everyone in attendance, we have some questions. Thank you very much for your questions. If you have any other questions while we're doing this, please feel free to throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as we kind of roll through. So the first one is from Hattie. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It says we'd like to try a free trial toggle where we turn on the free trial. The user gets to turn on the free trial or not to decide whether they want to use a trial or just they just want to pay up front. And have you tried something like that that's similar? And what, if so, what have you kind of noticed?
We have tried it. It's a good way to basically maximize your people who will convert directly to direct subscriptions and don't even need the free trial. It has not been a consistent winner for us. It's been very variable, basically. Some apps it does great on, and it's a nice LTV win. Some apps it doesn't perform as well as. I would say definitely test it. It's a great thing to test. It
Sure.
is definitely worth testing, but it's not going to be like a silver bullet. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it'll definitely work, but I would definitely test it if you haven't.
Okay. Next, we have Alina. Hi, Patrick. Thank you for the presentation. What questions should we include in the cancellation flows to better understand why users might be leaving?
Yeah, so typically what I start with is something around price to understand if that's driving it. Something around basically missing features, and that can either be if you have a feeling there are like specific things you know your product is missing relative to the competitors, you could just ask that specific feature, or you can just say like missing features or something more generic like that to get at like you just aren't doing something they want you to do. And you can even think then about like having a secondary box that pops up to allow them to like input what it is that's
Right.
missing. And then something around just basically like I've reached the end of the road and I don't need this product anymore. Unfortunately, that's a hard one to solve. That's probably one of those like it's probably like your least attractive churn bucket to try and address. But it's probably someone. And those are honestly those are the three I'd make sure you hit. I've seen other ones, but those are the core three for me.
Okay. Sounds good. Got a couple of anonymous questions here. Can you advise us on any examples of good hard paywalls that you've seen for inspiration?
I actually don't think there's anything unique you need to do about a design for a hard paywall. Meaning, I think a paywall design that works in the context of a not hard paywall works generally just as well for a hard paywall. So you don't have to think too much about design differences. And I think there's also great resources out there, including Adaptive. You have like kind of like examples of paywalls of different apps. Um, I would it's if you're an independent, smaller developer, it's not a bad strategy to look at what paywall designs bigger apps are using and use those as starting points. Those apps have likely done a lot of A/B testing to end up on those designs. And it is a thing that you will see certain designs work well across a broad range of apps. Like I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Blinkist paywall, where it
Mm-hmm.
says like this is how your trial is going to work on day one, on day three, on
Mm-hmm.
day seven, and like a lot of different apps have found success with that. Again, if you haven't tried it, you should try it in your app too. So I think of it more as like, anything that works for a soft paywall should work for a hard paywall. Just make sure the copy makes sense. It's not referencing like a free product if there isn't a free product.
Okay, great. Next question is also from an anonymous attendee. How does pricing something at $9.99 instead of $10 even, does that really make a difference?
It does. Is the short answer. We actually tested this. Interestingly, I had one like this is kind of one of those like I think like decades or centuries
Sure.
old, just
Yeah.
like human biases of like you look at
Yeah.
the first number and you get it lower, so you think it's good. But it really does work. We've actually tested this and run flat pricing versus the 99. Our thinking was like maybe people have like I don't know, human psychology has changed and they've tired of this trick and now
Sure.
they're gonna reward us for giving just like a flat basic price and no, it lost. So I would stick to the 99 cents ones.
Cool. Next up from Alina again, we've got do you implement weekly subs?
I've tested it as the honest answer on products. Our philosophy has been trying to keep it to products where we thought the use case aligned with weekly usage. So for example, if it was a product where it's like, hey, it's more of an episodic need, you're going to come
Hmm.
in, you need to do this thing once, twice, three times in a short period of time, and then you're probably not going to need to do it again for a long period of time. I
Right.
think a weekly subscription can make perfect sense in that regard. Like for example, um, call recording is a pretty
Hmm.
decent sized category in the App Store.
Hmm.
I think there's a decent argument that weekly subscriptions work for those. Like, I may just be going through something in my life where, like, hey, like I'm dealing with this issue and I want to record a couple calls for documentation, but like it's not an ongoing need for me.
Right.
I
Right.
don't know. That makes sense why you charge me a weekly subscription.
Right.
So like I think there are reasons it can make sense. Just think about does it make sense within the context of like your product and the use case is my
Right.
advice at least.
I think having like making sure that there's a natural fit, right, rather than trying to shoehorn it. So like two that come to mind for me are Flighty and Slope. So Flighty is a flight travel and travel application. You put in your flight and you can get all kinds of information about when it takes off and when it's going to arrive at your airport and whether it's late and all that stuff. Great if you're going on a trip, but you may not need it permanently if you're not a really frequent flyer. And Slopes is a way to track your snowboarding and skiing workouts that you do. Again, you might go on vacation, you might be going up to the mountain doing some skiing, but you're not necessarily a skier every week. So having, more flexibility there is useful. But just putting it in because it's an option probably isn't a great idea.
Like I think like if you're doing like for example like nutrition tracking, another very big
Sure.
category,
Sure.
it's really hard for me to make a case for why weekly subscriptions make sense there. Like
Right.
your product should be integrated into your user's life and it should be something they should
Right.
be embarking on a journey with and like they're going to use this for years to stay
Right.
healthy. Like it feels a bit exploitative, frankly, to then be
Yeah,
charging them a weekly price for that.
for sure. All right. And then our last question is from Chris. Chris says, what's a good savings percent for going from monthly to annual that would motivate the user to get the annual instead?
Our standard is annuals 10 times the monthly price. You're basically giving them 2 months for free. We will test kind of different variations of that. So maybe it's 11 times or 9 times or something like that. So that's not always the best, but that's my advice on like where to start. And I'd say it's something like 80% of the time that's probably going to be the best option for you.
Would you say it would be useful to, when you're kind of setting up your app, looking at other apps in that category to see if perhaps maybe the average savings is greater or lesser
Yeah.
and sticking with it, or
I think
once you,
so. And like I said, the despite what I said about like no one comparison shopping, when
sure.
I'm advising on a net new app that's launching for the first time,
Right.
almost always our first price is an average of the competitor's pricing, and we're looking
Sure.
at are they offering monthly and annual, and like we're trying to start there. With
Right.
the underlying assumption is like we've assumed they've done A/B testing that's led them to there, so we're going to
Right.
take that at face value, start there, but then we're going to do our
Right.
own testing on the other side of it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you need a baseline, right? So why not pick a baseline where you have a decent suspicion that that person or those people have already done that testing
Yeah.
to get you started, and then you can tweak from there for sure. Okay, I'll do one last kind of call out to the attendees for any additional questions. We'll wait a few more seconds for you guys to throw in some questions if you have any. Again, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And while we wait, I wanted to really thank Patrick here for joining us and sharing all of his wisdom. It was really, really valuable. I think there's lots of really great insights in the presentation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Of course.
And actually, one other thing I'd say on the last question about the
Yeah.
annual pricing, also call out that percent discount on your paywall. Find it to be quite impactful, like when you have the annual selected, to have some sort of like little sticker or icon that says like X% off,
Right.
to really reiterate that they're getting a deal by going annual.
Yeah. So don't assume that they're going to do the math, right? Like do the math
Yeah,
for them and show it to them for sure. Okay, I think we're all set with questions. So thank you, Patrick, for joining us. Thank you, attendees, for joining us as well. And we did record this session, and we will be sending it out to all of the folks who RSVP'd. So thanks for joining.
awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right, see you next time.